Thank you for having me here in Tokyo. I really enjoy being here, and thanks for the very kind introduction, Joey. I think I'm here because I like to make stuff, and as Joey had mentioned, I had actually hacked the Xbox at one point in time, and you can see sort of this little flow chart of my life in one page. When I was about 12 years old, I started by hacking my remote control car, and I connected it to my computer so I could play with it. Went to school, did some mischief with the Xbox, got into chip design, designed computer chips for a while. Then I designed some photonic circuits. Went to a startup called Chumby. This is where my sort of consumer electronics background came into play. I learned how to do manufacturing, got introduced to the Shenzhen ecosystem. And now today I'm independent, sort of, I call myself a boutique hardware sort of design person. And I have a few projects right now. I have a studio called Sutajo Kosagi, Bunnie Studios in Japanese. And I build products like my own laptop, which I'm using to give the presentation here, and a little project we call Chibitronics. I'll talk a little more about that, where we make sticker electronic circuits so you can integrate electronics with papercraft. And I do this with a student at the Media Lab. So my big concern lately has been about crossing what's called the gap. And the gap was the distance between the first prototype made in a laboratory. So on the left-hand side here, we have a picture of the sticker circuit prototype that the student at the Media Lab had made with her own hands, the hand soldering and assembly of the first unit. And the question is, how do you go from that to not necessarily a huge scale production, but how do you get to a reasonable scale where you can involve a conversation with a larger audience? Right? There's only so many people you can bring to your lab and just show how to build a circuit. But if you can actually turn it into something more closer to a product and build a few thousand of them, then many people can get involved. And the research becomes evolves into a different sort of entity. And just to talk a little more about the gap as it's been perceived, there's a common wisdom out there that in order to make hardware and for you to make money on hardware, you need to invest millions of dollars and you need like hundreds of thousands of units to sell to be profitable, right? The picture here is actually of a phone. It's a simple phone that was made in Shenzhen, but it's made for children, right? There's only 4 buttons and an emergency button, so you can call your parents and maybe your sister, and that's it. And it prevents, the children from being distracted by their phone in class, right? You want to be safe, but not, be a toy. This kinds of phone is what they call a niche market. Like not everyone can use it, and it's a kind of a risky thing to produce. And so if someone were to do this in, say, for example, the United States, they would need to raise millions of dollars and they'd have to sell hundreds of thousands of units to make money. But in Shenzhen, the cost for doing something like this is under $50,000. And they can be economical at production scales of 1,000 to 10,000 units, right? So these people can cross the gap from what may be considered almost a strange idea, a phone just for kids with 4 buttons only. They can't even really make that many calls, but they can make it economical in this ecosystem. And so the question I've been trying to answer is, what ecosystem makes this possible, right? How is this possible? The area that I do most of my work in is called the Pearl River Delta. It's the larger, a lot of times people will refer to it as Shenzhen, but it's actually a larger region they call the Pearl River Delta. In 2007, there was about 40 million people there, like about a third of the population of Japan. and they had a GDP of a $500 billion. And it's remarkable, this area in 1980 had, this is on the right-hand side is a graph of the population of Shenzhen, also from Wikipedia. In 1980, Shenzhen was 300,000 people. In 2011, there were 10 million people. The city grew basically out of nowhere. When I told my parents the first time I was going to go to Shenzhen, they said, you don't want to go there. It's a fishing village. There's nothing. It's a place for criminals and whatever. And when I went there, it was just this huge city that came out of nowhere. And even the people who were from China didn't expect this kind of growth. The ecosystem consists of several mega factories, really huge factories that employ 1 million people, factories with names like Foxconn and Huawei. They make products for Hewlett-Packard and Apple and many other brands, also Sony now. And these mega factories, started there, and what they created around them was thousands of smaller factories that no one talks about because they're too small for anyone to really recognize. They're about 1,000 to 10,000 workers in the facility. But these factories are specialty services to service the larger beast, right? If you have a CNC machine and need it fixed, you need someone who has the ability to fix your factory equipment. If you need basic components and supplies, you need people who can supply these. And so once you have this sort of diaspora, this ecosystem of smaller factories, it makes it even easier for you to start more big factories. So there's a tipping point that the ecosystem can reach to create this very dynamic sort of society. And so I was actually kind of glad. This is a slide from Joey's presentation, the keynote this morning, where he talks about Lemoore, and she's very proud of her pick-and-place machine. He explained there's a machine that can be used for automated assembly of electronics. And the cool thing in Shenzhen is that this is actually a very typical scene. You're driving on the highway, and you'll see on the truck next to you a pick-and-place machine going to another entrepreneur like a Lemoore somewhere else in the ecosystem. And it's very casual there. It's not like they even bothered to put it in a special box or whatever. They just sort of load it on a truck and they put tape on it to hold the parts on, and they just ship them back and forth between these smaller factories in the ecosystem, right? And when you have an ecosystem that's this dense, what you find is actually you start selling capability and not inventory, right? And to illustrate this point, let's consider an example of a USB cable, right? So on the top left there, I have a picture of there's a laser pointer here. There's a USB cable here, right? Everyone's familiar with this. If you go to Yodobashi Camera and you tell the store person, I want a 1.7 meter USB cable, please, right? He'll be, okay, strange that you want something so specific. And he'll show you the section, and you'll probably only find 1.8 or 1.5 or 2 meters, but not 1.7 meters. And then you explain to the store clerk, please, I want 1.7 meters, can you make it for me? I think he would laugh at you out here, right? But when you have an ecosystem closer to the right-hand side where people have raw wire and the connector parts and the machine to put them together, when you want a 1.7 meter cable, they just turn a knob to cut the wire to 1.7 meter, and the machine can make it for you. Even quantity 1, it's possible, right? The answer is not no anymore when you need something more custom, when you have an ecosystem of people who can make things, versus when you're so far from the factory, all the factory can do is create final finished goods, like finished USB cables. The answer is oftentimes no, if you want something that's custom. And many people who live in areas like Tokyo or in the United States, you're so far from the point of production that it seems impossible to contact the factory to ask them to just change the length of a wire, something so simple. But in Shenzhen, in that ecosystem, because you're surrounded and you're living in this ecosystem, that answer goes from no to yes, because these people, of course they want to sell more units. If they sell you even one cable at 1.7 meters, that's 1.7 meters less wire they have in inventory and $1 more they have in their pocket. They're happy to help. So in order to facilitate this ecosystem, a key ingredient is efficient discovery. How do you find this capability, right? Of course, if you go to a place that makes batteries and you ask them for cables, the answer is no, right? You have to find the place that makes the cable, and for them, it's just as easy as turning a knob for 1.7 meters or 1.8 meters, right? And what I've done is these are some satellite pictures of the electronic district in Shenzhen. So they call it the Huang Electronics District. I've roughly outlined in the box the size of their district. Here is Akihabara, that's sort of the train station there, and in that area there's a little area, I don't know if it still even is that popular anymore, but they sell parts, the Radio City, the transistors and these things. It's more sort of anime and cosplay there now, I think. But in Shenzhen, because they have thousands and thousands of manufacturers and warehousers, they fill out several city blocks, and these aren't just small buildings. They're like, there's an 88-story building or there with, full of, vendors and distributors. There's, just rows and rows of buildings. It's very large. And this is what a view of a typical inside of one of these markets might be. There's many, many small stalls. Each stall here is a representative of someone who's trying to sell a specialty, LEDs or cables, or sometimes they represent factories. And so when you go to them and you talk to them, and they show you what they have, if you don't see what you want, you can say, can you please make this? And I'd say about half the time they say, sure, how many do you need? Oh, 20, 25. They say, give me 1 week, and we'll have it for you, right? And that becomes the answer. The answer becomes yes, because it's so competitive. There's so many people trying to be discovered, trying to get new business. This is a kind of a typical view of inside of one of the stalls. It's sort of oftentimes a family business, a little bit sort of ramshackle, not very professional looking, right? But on the back here, if you've done production electronics, you recognize these are reels of components. Each of those flat round things have 10,000 capacitors or resistors on it. These people are dealing with volumes that you could then take to a phone factory that makes 1 million per month and then plug them in and actually produce. So even though this looks very humble, they're very serious in terms of the volume and the business that they represent. And that whole area that I was outlining there actually operates more like a gray market. It's not a well-regulated market. The goods there are not always new or even in good condition. But it actually, the fact that some people would say it's a bit illegal what they do, but the fact that something so flexible exists is actually very important in the hardware world. And the reason is that forecasting your demand is very hard. If you have a phone that makes 1 million phones per month, you ask your sales and marketing team, tell me please, how many units should I make this month? They say, I don't know, 1 million, right? But if they're even off by 1%, that's 10,000 phones excess production, right? And then your margin is actually still only a few percentage. And in consumer electronics, it's sort of like a net sum zero game. So in other words, when one model becomes popular, someone else is buying another model, okay? It actually turns out that if you go line by line in terms of the number of parts in the phone, 90% of even the new model phone is the same as the old model phone. They're very similar, right? They all have the same capacitors and screws and small parts. There's some custom parts, of course, like the core, like CPU and whatnot, but even the memory chips can be transported across generations. So what happens is that when one factory's production is ramping down, they have this problem of too much inventory. They keep it as parts, and they actually use the gray market to liquidate the inventory and get it into the new model phone, maybe perhaps even through a competitor. But this informal ability to go ahead and liquidate and to sell goods in a very flexible manner is very important for the ecosystem. And people like me who go out there can also take advantage of it. I don't have to be a big factory to buy it. You can come just as a person and buy, and then the prices are very low. Of course, there are risks in gray market. This here is actually also a very typical scene in Shenzhen. This person here is taking phones and recycling them. So he's picked them out of the trash, and he's pulling the circuit boards out. You can see he has a wire cutter there. And he's going to later on take the chips off, clean them, and sell them as new, right? Now the funny thing is actually these chips, because chips don't really wear out, they're good for a decade or two. Actually, these are in some ways, you can say now, well-tested components. And so they can be even more reliable than ones that are brand new, in some cases, right? It's a little funny. But actually, the question of like, are these things I'm getting in the gray market, are they new, are they usable? There's always, of course, a risk. But this kind of risk is something that you have to take, I think, to survive in today's business environment. So I have some examples of using the ecosystem. So every now and then I like to do small projects that are just more for the fun of it, but just to sort of to see if I'm actually performing at the benchmark that these people have set. And so, for example, here is a conference badge I made. It has a radio, a light controller, and a sound sensor in it. I only made 30 of them, and people at the conference bought them, and we sold them for 4,000 yen, and it made money at that price, right? And this is all in. This is including the setup fee and the R&D fee. So actually, we made about 60 total. We used up 10 for testing, and 10 of them didn't work. We still made money selling just 30 units at $40, right? So this is an example of what you can do using that ecosystem. Or another example is actually this presentation. It's hard to see, but over there is a strange laptop that I'm using to give the presentation. I made my own laptop using an ARM CPU and other parts, and we did a campaign around it, and we got about 500 people who are interested also in this laptop. And if I were to go to Sony and say, hi, I'd like to make a Vaio, and it's a concept and 500 people may buy it, right? It would be, the answer would be no. It's not possible, right? There's too much investment, too much engineering, too much effort. But this ecosystem is low cost enough that we're going to make not a lot of money, but we'll make a little money being able to do this. And we also learn a lot in the process of designing these things. So the question is Shenzhen a role model city? I mean, this is also not an uncommon scene. You have this wonderful, ultra-modern office building next to, I don't know, some residential place where, it doesn't look very well kept. Shenzhen is really more of a self-organizing chaos. The city is organizing to the people. There's some concept that there's zoned areas for manufacturing and office or whatever, but no one pays attention, right? There's plenty of office buildings that people live in, plenty of residential places use as office buildings. Here is, in the market, there's just kids playing with the random garbage on the floor. It's hard to see here, but they're actually taking cell phone parts and they're sliding them across the ground and sort of racing them around like their cars or something like this. But this is actually not an uncommon scene in these markets. And the kids are there because it's a weekend and the parents have to take care of the kids, but they also want to work, so they bring the kids to work. This happens all the time. It's a very natural thing for them to do. It's a very sort of self-organizing chaos. It's very important, I think one of the key things and when people ask me, how do we copy Shenzhen and Silicon Valley or something like that, a key thing that Shenzhen benefits from is a critical mass, a critical density of suppliers. And this is the critical density is a point at which the markets are no longer selling you parts, but they're selling you capability. That whole analogy I had about the USB cable. When you can go into a place and order exactly the length of USB cable you need, and the answer is yes, then you've replicated Shenzhen, right? Until that point, you still have this layer between the makers and the factories of distributors and this distribution network, and that causes trouble. And this whole layer came about, in essence, as part of the issue of dealing with market risk. This whole gray market, even though it's a great capability for discovery, one of its primary roles is the liquidation of inventory between different businesses. One other thing is, as Joey also mentioned, that the factory bosses will eat lunch with the factory workers and so forth. This is in part an artifact of the fact that almost every factory, in order to keep their labor costs low, provide housing to the workers, right? So when they build the factory, the land is relatively cheap. You'll have a facility that's so big, and then something about the same size next to it, where all the laborers go to rest. And this is a picture of all the workers going to lunch inside their dorm area during the shift change. And by providing sort of the housing and the meals, it reduces the load on the transportation. Like if all these people had to commute to their job, it'd be very difficult. I heard actually a story once from someone who worked with Foxconn at Apple, that the primary limiting factor for them building more iPhones was that the buses could not get people off for shift change fast enough. And so Foxconn had custom buses made where the front of the bus comes down so the workers can come out entirely through the front instead of through the door. And so then they could make more phones, right? And so these kinds of problems become real issues when you have masses of labor. It's also, Shenzhen is not just about manufacturing, but also there's many foreigner-friendly districts, so people can come from far away and feel at home and to transact business and to have a good time with friends. And I think that's also an important part in every city, to have an area that can accommodate, people coming from far away. And then I guess another thing I would want to note about the area is that, one of the reasons people attribute Shenzhen as being the way it is that it's technically sort of a free trade special economic zone. It's close to Hong Kong, which is a port city. These things are true and it makes things better, but in practice, the Chinese don't enforce the rules consistently. And even, for example, just this past Chinese national holiday, basically no one was able to export boxes from China for about 2 weeks. Everyone was telling them 2-week delay, 2-week delay. And this is right around holiday season, so it's even more urgent. But these things happen in China. So it's not like it's working perfectly, but still, despite all this, the ecosystem exists and thrives. So finally, just a few observations about sort of Shenzhen and me being a maker there, and the things that I think are most important from a city is that if you're in a business like physical good manufacture, building like physical items, this benefits from two things: scale and locality. The informal and liquid markets help stabilize the ecosystem. If it's not, you can't have it too rigid. You have to have some flex and ability to be able to weather the sort of the seasonality of electronics. And the other thing is that hardware is hard. I mean, there's a sort of notion that the hardware is the new software or whatever. It's not easy. It didn't get easier for any other magic than the fact that when you have a very dense ecosystem, you have a lot of expertise. You have a lot of people who are exactly the experts at exactly the thing you need, and they're all within about a 1-hour car ride of each other. And so there's a high supply of domain-specific expertise that you can use, and that makes your life easier in terms of building things. It's all half the promise, finding the right expert. And then my final point is that at the end of the day, I think that governments can try to steer an ecosystem to become like this, but ultimately it's the entrepreneurs who drive this economy, right? The Shenzhen is a success story, but no one likes to talk about the dozens of failures that also exist. There are many free trade areas in China that did not succeed. And in fact, if you drive around the Shenzhen area, you see other people trying to start competing electronic markets, right? The Huachan Electronic District is one of them, but every locality wants to have that sort of beating heart of commerce in their city. And so they create these huge buildings and they give subsidized space, and they try to pull people, and they want to kickstart that critical mass. And very few people can replicate that. But At the end of the day, when the conditions are just right, and I don't know what those conditions were, but when they are just right, you get this perfect storm of scale and entrepreneurs and people come together, and you can have a very thriving economy. So, thank you, Joy.